Some people get a warning before their world ends. Caroline got hers on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and quiet resignation, when a doctor who couldn't quite meet her eyes told her she had 4 days left to live. She drove home alone, made herself a cup of tea she never finished, and sat by the window watching the trees at the edge of her property sway in the October wind, those dark, dense trees she had always avoided after dark. What happened that night in the forest is something medicine has no language for, and by morning, Caroline Hughes was breathing without pain for the first time in months. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. Caroline Hughes had always been the kind of woman who made things work, not because life handed her easy circumstances, but because she had learned early that waiting for rescue was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had grown up in Ashford, a small town in western Massachusetts, where everyone knew your name and your mother's mistakes and the balance of your father's bank account. Hers had never been impressive. She had put herself through college on scholarships and part-time shifts, graduated with a degree in English literature, and taken a job teaching at the same middle school she had attended as a child, which felt, most days, less like a full circle and more like evidence that she hadn't moved far enough. She loved her students. She loved books. She loved the particular silence of early mornings before the rest of the town woke up. What she didn't love was the persistent feeling that she was living slightly smaller than she was capable of, that somewhere along the way she had accepted a version of her life that fit like a coat 2 sizes too tight. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Daniel, who told her she was a lot and meant it as a criticism. That relationship ended on a Wednesday in February, quietly, the way most painful things in Caroline's life did. Not with a dramatic scene, but with a slow, dignified unraveling that left her more exhausted than heartbroken. She hadn't dated seriously since. That was 2 years ago. Now she was 28, living alone in the small house she had inherited from her grandmother on the edge of town, where the property backed up against a stretch of dense, old-growth forest that locals had always treated with a particular kind of unspoken respect. She had never thought much about the trees. They were just there, dark and tall and permanent, like everything else in Ashford that existed before her and would exist long after. The diagnosis came in October, on a Tuesday that had started like any other. A routine follow-up for fatigue she had been dismissing for months. The doctor was young, uncomfortable with eye contact, and delivered the information with the careful tone of someone reading from a script they hadn't rehearsed enough. Multi-organ involvement, rapid progression, no viable treatment protocol. 4 days was the phrase that lodged itself somewhere behind her sternum and refused to move. She drove home in silence, made tea, and sat by the window watching the wind move through the tree line as the afternoon light dissolved into early dark. She wasn't crying. That surprised her. She was just very, very still. The way a person gets when the noise of ordinary life suddenly drops away, and what's left is something uncomfortably close to clarity. She didn't know, sitting there with her cold tea and her quiet house, that something in that forest already knew she was there. She went back inside before the cold got to her bones, but sleep didn't come. Caroline lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, the old radiator clicking, the wind pressing against the glass, the occasional creak of the floorboards near the hallway that she had learned to ignore years ago. She had always been good at ignoring things that unsettled her. It was, perhaps, her least useful talent. Around 2 a.m, the fever started. It came quickly, the way it always did when her body decided it had been patient long enough. First a chill that moved up her spine, then heat spreading from her chest outward, until even the cool air of her bedroom felt thick and suffocating. She got up, drank water, sat on the edge of the bathtub. told herself it was manageable. It wasn't. By 3, she was outside. She couldn't explain it afterward, not fully. She remembered unlocking the back door, remembered the cold grass under her bare feet, remembered the tree line looking closer than it usually did, as if the forest had shifted a few feet toward the house while she wasn't paying attention. What she didn't remember was deciding to walk into it. But she did. The trees swallowed the light from the house almost immediately. The air changed, colder, denser, with a stillness that felt less like silence and more like something holding its breath. Caroline moved without thinking, her fever-blurred mind registering only the sensation of bark against her palm when she reached out to steady herself, the soft give of the ground beneath her feet, the strange absence of wind inside the tree line, even though she could still hear it moving the branches overhead. She made it perhaps 50 feet before her knees gave out. She didn't fall so much as fold, slowly, like a piece of paper losing its shape, until she was on the ground with her cheek against the cold earth and her eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees ahead. And that was when she saw him. Or rather, that was when she became aware that he had been there for some time already. He was standing completely still between 2 large oaks, close enough that she should have noticed him immediately, far enough that his features were difficult to read in the dark. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that made him look like he had been assembled from the shadows themselves. He wasn't moving, he wasn't speaking. He was simply watching her with an expression she couldn't name, not alarm, not indifference, something more complicated than either. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. His voice was low and precise, carrying without effort through the still air. It held no trace of the local accent, no warmth exactly, but no coldness either, just certainty. Caroline opened her mouth to respond and found she had nothing left. The fever, the fear, the accumulated weight of the worst Tuesday of her life, all of it arrived at once, and she let it. The last thing she registered before the dark took her was the sound of his footsteps moving toward her, unhurried and deliberate, as if he had already decided what came next. She woke to warmth. Not the feverish, suffocating kind she had been living inside for weeks, but something steadier, like heat that came from the walls themselves, from the stone and wood of a place that had held temperature for a very long time. Caroline kept her eyes closed for a moment before opening them, an old habit from childhood, when she used to lie still in the morning and try to identify where she was by sound and smell before committing to consciousness. What she heard was silence, deep architectural silence, the kind that exists inside very old buildings with very thick walls. What she smelled was wood smoke, something faintly herbal she couldn't name, and beneath both of those, something darker and cooler that she had no reference for at all. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was high and vaulted, built from dark timber beams that crossed each other with the kind of precision that suggested they had been placed by someone who intended them to last centuries. The room was large and sparsely furnished, a stone fireplace on the far wall, with a fire that had been burning long enough to settle into steady, quiet heat, a single chair near the window, heavy drapes pulled almost completely shut. The bed she was lying in was enormous and deeply uncomfortable in the way that extremely old, extremely expensive things sometimes are. The mattress too firm, the linens too smooth, everything calibrated for permanence rather than comfort. She was still in her own clothes. That registered with a specific kind of relief she was slightly embarrassed by. She sat up slowly, waiting for the fever to reassert itself, for the familiar heaviness in her chest that had become her baseline over the past few months. It didn't come. She felt strange, not well, exactly, but different, lighter in some way she couldn't quantify. The door opened without a knock. Alexander Volkov moved through it the way he seemed to do everything, without hurry, without hesitation, as if the space he was entering had been arranged around his presence rather than the other way around. In the firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead in a way that seemed less like a choice and more like something he hadn't gotten around to addressing. Sharp jaw, pale skin, eyes that were a particular shade of gray that looked almost silver in the low light. He was objectively, almost unreasonably good-looking in the way of old portraits, features so precisely arranged they seemed less like accident and more like intention. He was carrying a glass of water, which he set on the nightstand without comment. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours," he said. "The fever broke around 4 in the morning." Caroline looked at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who found you before the cold did." It wasn't an answer. He seemed to know that and not particularly care. He moved to the window, adjusted the drape by an inch, looked out at whatever existed beyond it. His profile in the gray morning light was very still, and something about that stillness made her more alert than anything else so far, because it wasn't the stillness of a relaxed man. It was the stillness of someone exerting considerable control over something she couldn't see. Caroline drank the water because her throat was dry and because it gave her something to do with her hands while she tried to organize her thoughts into something resembling a coherent response to the situation she was in. She was in a house she didn't recognize, in a room she had never seen, with a man whose name she didn't know yet, feeling better than she had in months, which was, objectively, the most disorienting part of all of it. "I need to go home," she said. It came out steadier than she expected. Alexander turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment with that same unreadable expression she had caught in the forest. Not unkind, exactly, but measured in a way that suggested he was calculating something she wasn't privy to. "You collapsed in the forest at 3 in the morning with a fever of 104, he said. "Your car is at your house. You have no phone. It's on the nightstand, but the battery is dead, and it's currently 28 degrees outside." He wasn't threatening her with any of this. He was simply presenting information, the way a person does when they want to make clear that a decision has already been made, and they're simply allowing the other person time to arrive at the same conclusion. Caroline looked at the nightstand. Her phone was there, dark and useless. She looked back at him. "You know where I live?" "You're the only house within half a mile of this property. It wasn't difficult." She absorbed that. The forest behind her grandmother's house. She had walked into it and come out somewhere else entirely. Or rather, she hadn't come out at all. Someone had carried her. The thought arrived with a particular weight. "You brought me here," she said. "You were unconscious and hypothermic. The alternative was leaving you on the ground. Most people would have called an ambulance." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, brief and controlled. "I'm not most people." That was evident. Caroline set the empty glass back on the nightstand and pushed the heavy linen back, moving carefully to the edge of the bed. Her legs felt uncertain but functional. She stood, and the room tilted slightly before settling. He didn't move to help her, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. She had spent enough time being handled carefully by medical professionals to find the absence of it genuinely refreshing. She took stock of herself. The heaviness in her chest was gone, not diminished, gone. Her breathing was easy in a way it hadn't been since early summer. She pressed 2 fingers to her own wrist out of habit, feeling her pulse, steady, strong, nothing like the thin and irregular rhythm she had grown accustomed to. "My name is Caroline," she said, because it seemed important to establish at least that much. He was quiet for a moment. "Alexander." He said it simply, without offering anything else. Just his name in that precise, unhurried voice, with an accent she still couldn't fully place, Eastern European somewhere. smoothed by years of something else layered over it. She found herself wanting to ask where he was from and stopping herself, because it felt too personal for a conversation that hadn't decided yet what it was. She crossed to the window instead and moved the drape aside. What she saw stopped her completely. The house was enormous. She could see one wing of it from this angle, 3 stories of dark stone rising out of the landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built. And beyond it, in every direction, nothing but forest and the pale gray light of a winter morning that made the whole scene look like a painting done in a limited palette. "How long have you lived here?" she asked without turning around. He took a moment before answering. "Long enough," he said. And somehow, standing there at the window with the cold pressing through the glass against her palm, that answer felt less like evasion and more like a door left slightly open. He drove her home an hour later, in a car that was dark and expensive and very quiet, the kind of vehicle that absorbed road noise and conversation with equal efficiency. Carolyn sat in the passenger seat watching the forest give way to the edges of Ashford, the first gas station, the church with the broken gutter she had been looking at her whole life, the elementary school where she had learned to read, and felt the strange, dislocating sensation of returning to a life that no longer quite fit the shape she was in. She hadn't told him about the diagnosis. She wasn't sure why. It had been on the edge of several sentences during the hour she had spent in his kitchen, where he had made coffee with the focused efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times and found no particular comfort in it, and where they had spoken in the careful, exploratory way of 2 people trying to determine how much of themselves to offer without yet understanding what the exchange rate was. She had learned very little that was concrete. He had lived in the stone house for several years. He had no immediate neighbors beyond her. He worked, something in private asset management, said briefly and without elaboration, in the tone of a man who considers his professional life a separate country and has no interest in issuing visas. He asked about her work with the same measured curiosity he seemed to apply to everything, and she had found herself talking about her students longer than she intended, the specific pleasure of watching a child encounter a story that reorganized something inside them. He had listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. He pulled up to her house and stopped the car. In the daylight, her grandmother's house looked smaller than it ever had. The white paint slightly weathered, the front porch sagging at one corner she kept meaning to fix, the whole structure radiating the particular charm of a place held together by habit and affection rather than maintenance. She was suddenly acutely aware of how it must look to him. Then she was annoyed at herself for caring. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving me in the forest." It wasn't a difficult decision. He said it simply, no performance of modesty in it, and she believed him, which was its own kind of unsettling. She got out of the car and walked to her front door, finding her spare key under the mat with the guilty awareness that he was almost certainly watching her do it. She unlocked the door, pushed it open, and turned back once. He was still there, engine running, watching her with that steady gray gaze through the windshield, not smiling, not waving, just making sure she got inside, she realized. The thought did something small and inconvenient to her chest. She went in. She stood in her hallway for a long moment after the door closed, listening to the sound of his car pulling away, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that she felt better than she had in 6 months. She tried harder not to think about why. She called her doctor the next morning, not because she had changed her mind about the prognosis. She hadn't allowed herself to hope that far, but because something in her body felt different enough that ignoring it seemed like a particular kind of cowardice. Dr. Reeves answered with the careful tone he had been using with her since October, the one that communicated concern while maintaining professional distance, and she told him she wanted to come in. He fit her in at noon, She drove herself, sat in the same chair she had sat in 3 days ago, and let the nurse run the same panel of tests with the same quiet efficiency. Then she waited. Dr. Reeves came in 20 minutes later, looking at his tablet with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful neutrality of bad news, not the rehearsed warmth of managed expectations, but something genuinely unguarded. Confusion, she realized. He was actually confused. He ran the panel twice. Then he sat down across from her and said, very slowly, that the markers he had been tracking for 2 months were gone. Not reduced, not stabilized, gone. Caroline sat with that for a long moment. What does that mean? She asked. Medically? He shook his head. I don't know yet. I'd like to refer you to a specialist in Boston. This kind of spontaneous remission, if that's what this is, it's not something I've seen before. She drove home in the same silence she had driven to the office in, but it was a different quality of silence now, heavier, charged with something she wasn't ready to name. She sat in her driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. The logical sequence of events was not difficult to construct. She had been dying. She had walked into the forest. She had collapsed. Alexander had found her, and now she wasn't dying anymore. The problem was that the logical sequence of events led to a conclusion that had no business being logical. She went inside, made tea she actually finished this time, and stood at her back window looking at the tree line until the light started to fade. Then she did the thing she had been talking herself out of all day. She put on her coat, walked across her backyard, and went back into the forest. She didn't have to go far. He was there, not in the same spot, but close, standing at the base of a large oak with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her with an expression that suggested he had been expecting her and had spent some time deciding what to do about it. My doctor ran my blood work today, she said. He said nothing. Everything is gone. Still nothing. The trees around them were very still. Alexander. His name in her mouth felt different than it had that morning. More weight to it, more consequence. What did you do? He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his carefully maintained composure shifted, not breaking but bending, just slightly, in a way that told her the answer was real and complicated, and would change things between them regardless of what it was. Something I haven't done in a very long time, he said quietly, and something I can't entirely take back, and that's a wrap on part 1 of this story. If you're already hooked, honestly, same. Part 2 is coming, and things are about to get a lot more complicated between these two. Before you go, drop a number in the comments. How would you rate this story so far, 1 to 10? Your feedback genuinely helps. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.